Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, Consul 80 BCE, Pontifex Maximus 81-63 BCE. Metellus Pius grew up in the shadow of a famous father. In both contemporary sources and modern accounts, Metellus Numidicus looms larger than his son. However, whereas Metellus Numidicus was only at the height of his influence for about a decade, and participated briefly in only one war, Metellus Pius was one of the Senate's leading men for the 26 years between 89 and 63 BCE, exercising imperium in an active fashion for half or more of this period. A key pillar of the conservative faction, Metellus Pius was a pivotal figure in the last days of the Social War, the Civil Wars of the 80s, and the long and frustrating war against Sertorius. Upright, reliable, and brave, Metellus Pius became the living embodiment of filial piety and dedication to the Senate. However, Metellus Pius, while not devoid of ability, was not imbued with the charisma and intelligence of some of his more famous peers. He tried, and completely failed, to slow down Pompey's illustrious but unconstitutional career. Ironically, for all of Metellus Pius's hand-wringing about political norms and values, his own experiences arguably set a compelling precedent which allowed Caesar to justify his extended command in Gaul, and ultimately from there, overthrow the Republic. Metellus Pius was born around 129. His father, Metellus Numidicus, first rose to prominence by being an outspoken opponent of King Jugurtha of Numidia. He accused many of his senatorial colleagues of taking bribes from the king of Numidia and not enforcing Rome's treaty. Later, two consuls, the one in 111 and his successor in 110, failed to prosecute the war in Numidia with the expected vigor, and once again they drew the vitriol and righteous indignation of Metellus. In 109, he himself was elected consul, and just by virtue of going to Numidia and prosecuting the war with vigor, if not quite with strategic brilliance, he became a god of sorts for the conservative movement in Rome. As a young man, Metellus Pius married Licenia Crassa Secunda, the daughter of Lucius Licinius Crassus, who was consul in 95 and censor in 92. He is not to be confused with another Crassus from this period, who was the father of the famous Marcus Crassus the Triumvir. So I assume an uncle, most likely. Metellus Pius remained married to Crassa Secunda for their entire adult lives. However, one or both of them was infertile, and the pair never produced children. Later on, this forced Metellus Pius on his deathbed to adopt one of his cousins as his son and heir. Unfortunately, the man he chose turned out to be completely and totally incompetent and brought shame both to his native name and to his adopted name. But that is a different story for a different time. While Metellus Pius was not quite famous or lucky enough to get his own life from the biographer Plutarch, there are enough mentions of him in our surviving sources that we know a great deal about his career. It's pretty rare that we know the details of someone's early career, but we're actually very well informed about Metellus Pius by contrast. In 109, when he was about 20 years old, young Metellus accompanied his father to Numidia, and there he served as a contubernalis. In Latin, this means tent companion, but in modern parlance, it's something more akin to an aide-de-camp. It would seem that young Pius served as a combination of staff officer, messenger, and bodyguard. If we read backward from the implication of what Plutarch says in the life of Sertorius, where Sertorius challenges Metellus Pius to a duel, and Metellus Pius declines, and later on Plutarch comments that he is not quite as vigorous as he once was, it would seem that as a young man, Metellus Pius was known for his physical stamina and strength. So perhaps Sertorius thought he was still the same man and would come out and give him a good showing. But alas, Metellus Pius's fighting prowess declined over time, as happens to most people. Metellus served by his father's side as contubernalis from 109 to early 107, and as such he had many interactions with Gaius Marius. Marius was a client of the family and a rising star politically. Marius was also an excellent soldier who had a long and distinguished record. For the most part, Metellus Numidicus and Marius got on very, very well until Marius decided that he wanted to run for consul and go back to Rome while Metellus was still in Africa. Metellus was very dismissive of Marius's ambitions, and in one conversation where young Metellus Pius was nearby, his father gestured to him and told Marius, "You can run for consul when this boy does." Since Metellus Pius most likely would not be eligible to run for another 20 or so years at the minimum, this was a great insult to Marius, who very likely would be dead by that time. Marius did not take this well, and this led to the great breakdown between Metellus and Marius. Of course, after Metellus' father died, he inherited Marius as a political enemy, and this became something of a running feud. Eventually, Marius went back to Rome, won the consulship, and then got the tribal assembly to vote to replace Metellus with himself. Metellus Numidicus was deeply depressed, and his son would have been his chief comfort during this time. When the pair returned to Rome, both were surprised that Numidicus received a hero's welcome, triumph, and the cognomen Numidicus. I've been referring to him in this way just for the sake of clarity, since he and his son have the same name, but he did not officially become Numidicus until his return to Rome in early 107. From 107 forward, Metellus Numidicus was something of a living legend in Rome, and he was arguably the most prestigious man in the Senate, at least until the return of Marius, when he finally held a consulship in Rome itself. Metellus Numidicus led the block of people who were opposed to Marius's back-to-back-to-back-to-back consulships. And as such, he was seen as the guarantor of the senatorial order, the man who might have the best chance of stopping Marius in some way. Eventually, however, when Marius did return to Rome, he wanted to reward his veterans and confirm his military reforms, and therefore he enlisted the help of people such as Saturninus and Glaucia, and these individuals also happened to have some fairly deep-seated grudges against people like Metellus Numidicus. Saturninus managed to create a bill which forced senators to swear their allegiance to the provisions of this bill, and while most senators caved after vigorous opposition and then pledged to uphold it, Metellus Numidicus decided to stick with the principles that had gotten him where he was in life, refused to take the pledge, and was therefore ousted from the Senate and exiled. Now that his father was in exile on Rhodes, Metellus Numidicus had an obvious, heartfelt, and popular cause that he could champion, i.e., the recall of his father. After his father went into exile, Metellus began to campaign vigorously, starting in the year 99 after the fall of Saturninus and Glaucia, to get his father recalled. And he did this in a way which the sources describe as vigorous, but some of his contemporaries at that moment may have found maybe even a bit annoying, because this was literally the only thing that he would talk about. In 98, now that the influence and popularity of Gaius Marius had subsided considerably, the ambitious young tribune Quintus Caecilius took up Metellus' petition and had the tribal assembly officially recall Metellus Numidicus. Numidicus received one last hero's welcome when he returned to Rome, but the real winner was his son, who had successfully brought his father home. Metellus earned the agnomen Pius, and despite the relationship between the Latin word pius and the English word pious or piety, it actually denotes one's dedication to one's parents and ancestors rather than devotion to the gods. At least that was the primary meaning for the Latin word, and over time, Pius evolved into pious, and the meaning changed as well. As for Numidicus, as I've argued in a previous video, he may have been perfectly content staying behind in Rhodes. He was studying rhetoric and philosophy, and that seems to have been a little bit more to his taste by this point in his life. Not only that, but by going to the tribal assembly, Metellus Pius had used the tool of the opposition. The tribal assembly was normally used by the Popularis faction rather than the Optimate faction. At least that's usually how things worked, but of course it is merely a political tool and not a hard and fast thing that is strictly the prerogative of one faction. In the year 80, Metellus Pius decided to return the favor by backing the new man Callidius's bid to be praetor. This is significant because it shows that Pius was well aware of the error that his father Metellus Numidicus had made back in 108 or 107, namely deriding the ambition of a new man in Gaius Marius. Metellus Pius, while like many Roman aristocrats, he could be prickly at times, he did at least acknowledge and try to work with the ambitions of people who were his political allies. So he did learn some from his father's mistakes. In general, he does seem to have learned from his father's experiences, and unlike his father, who was in the depths of despair prior to his unexpected triumphant return in 107, Metellus Pius always seems to have kept a stiff upper lip and to have realized that the Senate was not likely to turn on him if he kept doing his duty. So he learned a fair amount from the experiences of his father, and in many ways one could argue that he was a little bit wiser than Metellus Numidicus had been. In the 90s, probably not long after the return of his father, Metellus Pius was elected to the College of Pontiffs. In 91, his father Metellus Numidicus died, and that same year the social war erupted across Italy due to Roman exploitation of his allied subjects and the steadfast refusal, especially by the conservative bloc in the Senate, to grant citizenship to Latin and Italian allies. This exploitation took the form of Rome fighting foreign wars and giving far more of the spoils to Romans than to the allies, even though the allies did as much of the fighting. When Rome did periodic land redistributions, the land went to poor Romans and came mostly from prosperous peasants who were not citizens, and even some of the local gentry who were not full Roman citizens. So you can see how this relationship was not one conducive to social order. The term social war, of course, derives from the fact that the allies were known as the Socii in Latin. The war itself, not terribly social, unless you consider massing up in large formations and battering each other a fun social activity. Metellus was most likely active throughout the entirety of the war, as he was entering kind of his political prime by this point. He would have been in his mid to late 30s, and the war took place between 91 and 88. We don't know most of what he did during this time. However, by late 89, we know that he was a legate for Pompeius Strabo, the father of Pompey the Great, in the north, and that he won some battles against the Marsi in that area. So he was acquitting himself well, but the three major generals of this conflict were Marius, Sulla, and Pompeius Strabo. The social war was a brutal conflict between two sides which were armed in the same fashion and conducted themselves in the exact same manner. Needless to say, that is not conducive to decisive warfare, especially when the numbers are a little bit more on the side of the allies than the Romans. Despite the generalship of Sulla and a couple of others, the Romans hadn't made all that much headway in the grand scheme of things, and eventually they figured out that the only real solution to the war that would bring it to a halt in a timely fashion without the loss of too much life would be a diplomatic solution whereby they granted the Italians what they wanted. This led to the passage of the Lex Plautia Papiria, And this piece of legislation was, without a doubt, the most important piece of bringing the social war to an end. In 88, Metellus Pius was elected praetor, and he was given the task effectively of enforcing this new law and being the face of Rome's policy. So he was the praetor entrusted with enrolling Italian allies as Roman citizens within 50 days of the passage of this bill. Between their military victories and the passage of the Lex Claudia Papiria, the Romans were able to bring to heel most of the allies. Around this time, possibly in connection with his efforts to get the Italians to register as Romans, a young Marcus Tullius Cicero happened to hear Metellus Pius speak in public, and he said that while Metellus was not the greatest speaker he had ever heard, that he was relatively competent. Coming from Cicero, that is somewhat high praise. Then again, Cicero is rarely critical of the speaking abilities of people whose politics he liked. So take it with a grain of salt, I suppose. After enrolling the Italians, Metellus was then dispatched south to relieve the legate Gaius Casconius in Apulia, and he would be entrusted with finishing the war there. The preeminent Italian leader of the social war was Quintus Popedius Silo. He had worked with Drusus to try to pass legislation in Rome, and after Drusus's assassination, he had then raised the banner of revolt across Italy. He was still with the holdouts in Apulia, and he was, without a doubt, the most wanted man in Rome. Metellus Pius went to Apulia, and after laying waste to the countryside, set up a line around the city of Venusia, and in the process of storming the city, managed to kill Silo in action. This means not only that Metellus Pius, as a mere praetor, was responsible both for implementing the diplomatic solution to the social war, and then he received the honor of inflicting the final defeat on Silo. This is something which is almost unprecedented. Rome rarely would give a praetor this much credit and put him in such a position to really burnish his resume. This means that Metellus Pius, for whatever reason, was seen as the best face of the Senate, and they wanted the Italians to look at him as the sort of embodiment of their political order. Perhaps because of his reputation for virtue, they thought that the Italians would be more likely to trust in Metellus and see the combination of fairness on the one hand and toughness and resolve on the other. This is me speculating a bit, but I believe that Metellus Pius was the kind of guy who could very much fulfill that role, and the Senate decided to use him accordingly. In 88, Metellus Pius's good friend and political ally Lucius Cornelius Sulla was elected consul and entrusted with the command in the east against Mithridates. Mithridates of Pontus had taken advantage of Rome's preoccupation with fighting its own allies in order to overrun Roman possessions in Asia Minor and in Greece. Sulla was on the march to the east when he received news that Marius had gone to the tribal assembly and had the command against Mithridates reassigned to himself. Rather than accepting this laying down as Metellus Numidicus had a few decades before, Sulla, who had earned the loyalty of his men, turned his army around, marched on Rome, got rid of some of his rivals, and recovered his command by force. Metellus was one of the few people in the field with an army who could have potentially done something about this, but he was an ally of Sulla, and he was otherwise occupied at the moment. In 87, Metellus's command was prorogued by the Senate, possibly due to continued opposition from the Samnites. That was the official reason, but also probably as a precautionary measure as well, in case some of the discontent elements in Rome after Sulla's departure were to get out of hand. That same year, as the Senate correctly predicted, Cinna and Octavius began to wage a civil war, and Cinna was joined by the elderly Marius, who had escaped Rome, and by the ambitious and capable Sertorius, and this force began initiating a siege of the capital of the Republic. Metellus Pius, as the only commander around with a standing army, of course, was the only person in a position to respond. The Senate ordered Metellus to make a treaty with the Samnites and rush his army back to Rome to save them from the combined army of Cinna and Marius. Metellus did as he was ordered, came back to Rome, and encamped in the Alban Hills, not far from the city and from the other army. Here he was joined by other people who were determined to resist the efforts of Marius and Cinna. Among them Publius Licinius Crassus, the consul of 97, censor of 89, and father of the Triumvir, and also by Gaius Octavius, the consul who had been ousted by Cinna. When he arrived in camp, Octavius demanded command, but Metellus's men would not accept the change because they were used to his command, and also because, as we'll see, it would appear that Metellus had the ability to command a good deal of loyalty from his soldiers, an ability he shared with his father. The Senate gave Metellus the power to negotiate with Cinna, since Octavius clearly didn't have any standing with him, and the two men were able to hammer out an agreement where Cinna was recognized as consul and peace was restored, but not for long. It appears that Cinna was less than forthcoming about his intentions. When Cinna broke his agreement and began to seize power in Rome with the support of Marius, Sertorius, and others, Metellus realized that without his army, which had been disbanded, he couldn't really do that much to stop him, so he decided to go somewhere where he had some support and raise an opposition force. He went to Roman Africa, where his father had earned quite a reputation and where he himself had some experience and connections, and he began to raise a small army. In early 86, he recruited private clients, made contact with the friendly king of Numidia, and produced a claim that he was the pro-Praetorian governor. He pretended that he was here legally, and he sent Cinna a message that he was just acting as governor, nothing to be concerned about. Cinna, however, knew exactly why he was there, and also that the Senate had not sent him. Accordingly, he dispatched Gaius Fabius Hadrianus with an army to relieve Metellus Pius of his provincial command. This resulted in a battle that Pius lost in the Roman province. He then retreated with his remaining forces to Numidia. They teamed up against the forces of Fabius and lost once again. With the king of Numidia in tow, Metellus fled from Africa and eventually arrived at Mauritania to the west, and then all the way to Liguria in northwest Italy by early 83. The African gambit had failed for him, however, it had produced a distraction for Cinna. So perhaps it was not a total and complete loss, but still it shows that Metellus Pius, while he was bold and imaginative on a certain level, was far from a military genius. In northern Italy, Metellus was able to recruit some men and form a small army. In Rome itself, Cinna had died and Carbo had risen to power. Carbo presided over the Senate there, and that body declared Metellus Pius a public enemy officially. Metellus then marched and joined Sulla on the Appian Way, where Sulla recognized his claim to authority as a praetor and officially made him a legate. Most likely, Metellus was the senior legate of Sulla, even if he was not necessarily that in terms of the number of troops he had under his command. In 82, as part of his ongoing civil war with Carbo, Marius the Younger, and Sertorius, Sulla sent Metellus to the north with Pompey, Crassus, and Lucullus under his command. It's hard to think of three more ambitious and able legates to have. Metellus, with the help of these able legates, defeated Gaius Carinus at Picenum. Later, at the city of Faventia, Metellus decisively defeated Gaius Norbanus, and this effectively destroyed his army, which was, at that time, the last major Senan field force. So Metellus played a pretty key role in bringing the civil wars of the 80s to an end. Upon his victorious entry into Rome, Sulla lavishly rewarded his followers with honors, titles, and allowing them to hunt down and claim the estates of his political opponents if they hunted down men whose names were on the proscription list. Men such as the infamous Catiline were able to amass quite a bit of money doing just that. However, Metellus Pius did not participate in the proscriptions. For one, he was far too wealthy and dignified to stoop to such lows, and secondly, of course, the entire reputation of the Metellii was based on this kind of above-the-fray dignity that his father had cultivated a few decades before. In 81, however, Sulla finally gave Metellus Pius his due when he rewarded him with the vacant position of Pontifex Maximus. Normally, this would be decided in an election, but at this time, Sulla was still dictator and he could do what he wanted. The position had been vacant for about a year or so, ever since the Senans had murdered the previous Pontifex Maximus, and this is an office which Metellus Pius would hold for the remainder of his life, which was going to be the next 18 or so years. As dictator, Sulla enacted a number of important reforms which were designed to curb what he saw as the abuses of the last generation. The powers of the tribunes and the tribal assemblies were greatly curtailed, and the cursus honorum, that is, having to go through the offices in a set sequence, wait a set amount of time between offices, and also wait a certain amount of time between consulships, was finally set into statutory law. This order gradually eroded over time until it was gone by around 60 or so. Many modern historians think that after Sulla's death, there was no one there to really try to uphold it. However, that is to largely ignore the political career of Metellus Pius, and to be fair, also the career of Lucullus. Sulla had a number of ambitious young men destined for great things who flocked to his banner, Pompey, Crassus, and Lucullus being among them, and each of them had his own ambitions. Pompey wanted to be sort of a new Scipio Africanus, someone who worked within the republican system, but did things that no other Roman had ever done. Crassus wanted to cash in his great wealth in order to win greatness for himself on the battlefield and in politics. He was mostly successful at doing that. And then Lucullus was much more a politician in the mold of Sulla, someone who wanted to be a great commander following the constitution and upholding the prerogatives of the Senate. Lucullus, of course, was far less ruthless in his pursuit of all this than Sulla had been, but still there are quite a few parallels. It's safe to say, however, that Sulla trusted Metellus Pius more than any of those younger men. Metellus Pius was more experienced, he was more dependable, and he was more dedicated to upholding Sulla's reforms. Metellus Pius did not owe his rise to any kind of special circumstances the way that Pompey had. Metellus Pius, like Sulla himself, was born into a rich and powerful family, and his family name had gotten him where he needed to be. That was how the system should work in Sulla's mind, and Metellus Pius was the perfect example of the kinds of politicians his ideal system would produce. What's there not to like about Metellus Pius from Sulla's perspective? Also, one thing that Metellus had going for him is that unlike some of the men who had helped Sulla come to power, Metellus Pius had not really stained his hands with blood. While he had fought in wars, he had not engaged in any kind of massacres, and he had abstained completely from the proscriptions. This meant that he could command more general respect than most Sullans. If he took a stance, it would be taken more seriously. If he said that we need to sign an oath here not to butcher each other, people might believe that he wouldn't be carrying a dagger and then whip it out and take them out after he took the oath. In the year 80, perhaps to signal Metellus' ascendant status, Metellus and Sulla served side by side as consuls. Soon thereafter, Sulla left the dictatorship. It was fairly clear from the context that he viewed Metellus Pius as the successor to the mantle of leader of the conservative faction. Earlier, when I was talking about the Senan faction in Rome, I mentioned that there were some key players in it. You have Marius the Elder, Marius the Younger, Cinna, Carbo, and Sertorius. Sertorius most likely would not be mentioned in our sources in connection with his activities back in the civil wars of the 80s, if not for the revolt that he led in Iberia. As the most senior survivor of the Senan faction, Sertorius was able to escape Rome and fled ultimately to Hispania Caetirior. This is the northeastern section of Roman Spain, and there he was able to establish a foothold. At first, the Senate was not all that concerned because Sertorius only had a merry little band of followers and was probably not going to be a huge threat. However, it became clear that the local Sullan forces could not contain Sertorius, so the Senate upgraded Hispania Ulterior, southern Spain, to a proconsular province and allotted it to Metellus Pius, who arrived to take command in 79. By this point, Sulla had largely withdrawn from public life. He had laid down the dictatorship, and he most likely was suffering from the terminal illness that would kill him early the next year in 78. It appears that he died from something like stomach cancer. It apparently was quite painful, and he died in agony. At any rate, though, Metellus Pius was not dead, but he did have one hell of a war on his hands. Upon his arrival in Hispania Ulterior, Metellus Pius set up 4 key bases and dispatched his legate Thorius to reinforce the governor of Hispania Caetirior, Marcus Domitius Calvinus. He felt that he was acting before Sertorius was able to muster much real strength, and felt that the combination of the existing governor and his legate would be enough to bring Sertorius to heel. Unfortunately for Metellus, Sertorius was able to crush Calvinus's force before Thorius arrived, so he was able to defeat the enemy in depth. Crushing Calvinus, Sertorius then crushed Thorius and had defeated 2 armies in a very short period of time. This caused his following to swell. By this time, Plutarch tells us that Metellus was no longer young and vigorous, that he had been inactive for the last few years, and that he had become accustomed to a life of luxury. We also know that even after several years in Spain, Metellus never really recovered his youthful energy and also had a lot of trouble adapting to the hit-and-run warfare of Iberia with its mountainous terrain. Metellus's idea of warfare was clearly leading a serried line of infantry against another line of infantry in a field battle and inspiring the men and just sort of mauling his way through. Metellus Pius was a very uncreative but competent commander, but he had some severe limitations and was not able to think outside of the box. The war quickly turned into an infinite source of frustration for Metellus Pius. He made an abortive advance on the Tagus River in 79, only to come up empty. In one engagement, Sertorius rode up to Metellus's lines and offered to duel him. Metellus, who was very popular with his men, was first urged on with cheers to go out and put Sertorius in his place. However, Metellus realized that he was a middle-aged man and that he probably wouldn't take Sertorius, so he turned him down, and this led to his men jeering and mocking him for being a coward. Sertorius was able to inflict a major defeat on Metellus at Lacobriga in 78, which was then compounded by the victory of Sertorius' general Lucius Hertulius over the army from Transalpine Gaul, which was supposed to strike Sertorius in the rear. So that army was then forced to go home, while Metellus' own army was also defeated. Metellus was ultimately forced to abandon Hispania Ulterior by the end of 78, and this was almost certainly the low point of both his career and his life. The norm in Rome was for consuls to serve as proconsuls and for commands to change hands. However, the consuls of 78 both expressed less than no interest in going to Iberia. They had heard about Metellus' struggles there, and they thought that their careers would not benefit from fighting Sertorius. This led to the prorogation of Metellus' command. This is both a testament to his standing in the Senate, that he was given more opportunities to fight, even though he had not been successful so far, and it also simply shows that despite the fact that supposedly this Sullan faction was trying to uphold all of Rome's traditions, they were pretty selective in their enforcement of those traditions. The Senate was, however, greatly alarmed by Metellus' failures, and they decided that he could use some help in bringing Sertorius down. They accordingly dispatched the young and somewhat problematic Pompey and his personal army to help. Pompey had the authority of a proconsul, even though at this juncture in his career, he still had not technically even entered the cursus honorum in any meaningful sense. Pompey arrived in late 77, and the two men worked well together throughout the time they shared command. Once again, although Metellus Pius on paper is a stickler for the cursus honorum, he could be flexible when he needed to be, and rule enforcement was very selective and based on convenience rather than strict principle, unless you're Cato the Younger. By early 76, Perperna led the survivors of Lepidus' failed revolt and joined Sertorius, so both sides received significant reinforcements after a mostly uneventful 77, where Sertorius was organizing his government and Metellus was licking his wounds and rebuilding his army. In 76, Metellus Pius gave his young colleague the honor of fighting Sertorius, while he himself was content to simply go after Sertorius' legates. Perhaps he had lost some confidence in his abilities after his previous experiences, and also maybe he felt that Pompey would be a better match for Sertorius. At this time, Pompey had yet to taste defeat. However, that was going to change rather rapidly. At the Battle of Lauron, Sertorius was able to inflict heavy losses on Pompey's army, and his army was trapped and in danger of being destroyed until Metellus was able to slip past one of the Sertorian legates and save Pompey's army. Pompey's losses were around 10,000 men, but the Senate was the side with the greater manpower pool, and they were able to make good these losses and then resume the offensive in 75. I've also noticed that because a lot of our data for these battles comes from Plutarch, who is notoriously not the best military historian, the number 10,000 will appear more than once, and because of that, it appears to me to be a little suspect, but without alternative information, I suppose we're stuck with it. Going into the year 75, Metellus and Pompey decided that they needed a new strategy. Both having been crushed at the hands of Sertorius, they decided that neither of them would like to experience that level of humiliation again, so what they would do is effectively what Fabius had done when faced with Hannibal's generalship. They would avoid any battles with Sertorius personally, and instead focus their efforts on fighting battles when one of his subordinates was in command. On his side, Sertorius thought that he was trapped between two commanders. Pompey was commanding in the northeast of Spain, and Metellus was commanding in the south, so he knew that a defeat anywhere could potentially be devastating to his control of the territory. He therefore needed to win a victory on at least one flank to secure his ability to go all in after the other commander. Believing that Pompey was still beaten in the wake of the battle at Lauron, Sertorius decided to march with his main body to join his subordinate Tertullius and try to crush Metellus in the south first. This meant leaving Perperna and Herennius behind in the east to face Pompey. It's unclear exactly what Sertorius' orders were, but it is clear that morale among the Sertorian forces in 75 was sky high, and that all of his major legates believed that they were military geniuses on par with Sertorius himself. Sertorius was on his way to the south to try to double up on Metellus when he received news that Pompey had marched out of his camp, challenged Perperna and Herennius to an open battle, and that Pompey had won overwhelmingly against his legates. This forced Sertorius to double back to the east in order to prevent an overrun of his territory there, and it meant that now Metellus in the south had a good chance to do something productive. Even when he learned that his chief, Quintus Sertorius, would not arrive, Lucius Tertullius was still confident in his ability to defeat Metellus. After all, he had been Sertorius' most successful legate up to this point, and he had won a couple of battles in independent command. His army was on par with Metellus's, and so he thought that he could help win this war on behalf of his faction by seeking out and winning a decisive battle with the Roman proconsul. Near Italica, an important Roman colony in Spain, Tertullius drew up his force in battle array at dawn and waited for Metellus Pius to come out of camp and fight him. This day proved to be exceptionally hot, and Metellus took advantage of that fact by resting his men while Tertullius and his men waited for them in the blistering sun. Metellus took the time also to observe the disposition of Tertullius' troops and noticed that his quality men, by which he probably means the Romans in the force, were all in the center, and the flanks were being held by less disciplined men. Metellus accordingly decided that when he went to battle, he would focus his attacks on the flanks and recess his center, so that it would come into contact last, and hopefully come into contact and fix the enemy in their front at a time when the flanks are being overwhelmed. Metellus deployed his men at noon, and the plan worked exactly as he had drawn it up. Tertullius' men were fatigued, Metellus' men were fed, watered, and rested. His men accordingly were able to overwhelm Tertullius' flanks, and then pulled off an encirclement and destruction of Tertullius' center. This is by far the most impressive victory of Metellus Pius' career, and it shows that while he was not the best general in the world, he did have his moments, and he could take advantage of someone who became overconfident the way that Tertullius had. Metellus was able to inflict a damaging 20,000 losses on the Sertorian army, and he set off in hot pursuit of Tertullius' fugitive army. While Metellus Pius most likely did expect to win the Battle of Italica, I have to imagine that he was as shocked as anyone by the overwhelming nature of his victory. However, as soon as the victory was won, he realized that he had a golden opportunity to end the war that year. He contacted Pompey and told him that what they should do is catch Sertorius in a pincer while they had such an overwhelming numerical advantage. It would appear that Pompey was on board with this plan and wanted to win it that year, taking advantage of the great victory at Italica. However, for whatever reason, Pompey managed to botch the plan by engaging Sertorius by himself at the Battle of Sucro and sustaining another devastating defeat. Once again, Pompey was trapped in his camp after having suffered heavy losses, and it was only the timely arrival of Metellus' army, now unable to be screened by any Sertorian force, which enabled Pompey to escape and force Sertorius to fall back. Sertorius, who felt that he was on the verge of winning his greatest victory of the war, groused famously, "If the old woman had not made an appearance, I'd have trashed the boy and packed him off to Rome." He called Metellus an old woman because he thought that Metellus was excessively cautious and he was still mocking Metellus's unwillingness to fight a duel with him. Sertorius fell back, and he more or less left the Roman section of Iberia for the Celtiberian section. As he was fleeing, Metellus and Pompey pursued. Sertorius wanted to go deeper into the interior and use guerrilla warfare, but his men compelled him to stand and fight at one of the many cities called Segontia. It most likely was a home base for many of them, and they decided that it could not fall without a fight. Plutarch records the city's name as Saguntum, but most likely that is a mistake since Saguntum was on the coast, and Sertorius would not have fallen back to a place which was further from his base than where he started. That wouldn't really make much sense. This battle was hard fought. It raged from noon to night, and it was the last major pitched battle of the Sertorian Revolt. Sertorius planned to face Pompey on one flank, while his two remaining legates, Tertullius and Perperna, faced off against Metellus on the other. However, Tertullius fell early in the fighting, so Sertorius took command of the flank against Metellus and sent Perperna to fight against Pompey. Sertorius' strategy was to take advantage of his personal physical advantages over Metellus, so he mounted several surges against Metellus Pius in person. Metellus Pius, while he was not willing to fight a duel, was brave enough to stand his ground and acquitted himself well. However, in one of those surges, one of Sertorius' men was able to wound Metellus with a spear. Metellus' men were very loyal to their commander, and they shielded him, took him to the rear, and then grew infuriated at the near death of their beloved general, so they rallied, charged, and routed the Sertorians. Metellus was wounded, and he was more than happy to rest after the battle. He settled down in his camp, and he felt secure, especially after he learned that Pompey had routed Perperna's army. Sertorius, however, was not content with the day's outcome, and he decided to take advantage of Metellus' laxity by regrouping and launching a surprise attack on Metellus' camp in the evening. He was trying to cut off Metellus with some kind of a trench, according to Plutarch. However, Pompey arrived quickly, and Sertorius was then forced to fall back. The battle was a decisive victory for the Roman side, however, not one which was a war ender. Sertorius lost 3,000 men in the fighting, Perperna lost 5,000, Pompey lost 6,000, and Metellus' losses are unknown. How Pompey managed to somehow lose more men than the force that he routed is unclear, but I presume that many of them were lost when he launched his attack against Sertorius to bail out Metellus. If I had to estimate Metellus' losses, I would think that his losses would be at least equal to those of Sertorius, about 3,000, maybe even a little bit more. At any rate, Pompey and Metellus had successfully pursued and routed the Sertorian army. Segontia was the last major field battle of the Sertorian War. However, it didn't do all that much to bring the war to a close. Over the next 2 years, Metellus and Pompey remained in Spain, trying in vain to bring Sertorius to heel. Sertorius resorted to guerrilla tactics now that he had lost too many men to fight in the open field, and neither Pompey nor Metellus was particularly effective at dealing with this threat. In 74, Metellus escorted 2 new legions to the theater, but he decided to leave most of the active campaigning to his younger and more vigorous colleague. He helped out with a couple of sieges, but didn't really do all that much in the grand scheme of things. Over the winter of 74 to 73, Metellus hit upon a new strategy. He announced a reward of 100 silver talents and 20,000 acres to any Roman who agreed to betray and kill Sertorius. His hope was that one of the common Romans who was following Sertorius would take up the offer and then try to become a rich man back at home. In the event, however, the man who killed Sertorius was his chief legate, Perperna, a former follower of Legates who had arrived in Spain with additional forces and also some lackluster military ability, which had ultimately cost Sertorius a couple of battles. Perperna then compounded his stupidity with treason. He murdered Sertorius, and that brought the Sertorian War to an end. Whatever he was expecting, Perperna was not rewarded, but he also was put to death. I think you could say that if there is any one Roman who is the closest equivalent of Benedict Arnold, it is probably Perperna, but rather than a gallant and successful general, Perperna was pretty incompetent and also a backstabber in the most literal sense possible. In the year 71, after the assassination of Sertorius, Metellus spent his time getting his province in order, levying new taxes, and making sure that his successors would be able to govern in peace. Metellus Pius and Pompey returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph together on December 30th, 71 BCE. Metellus Pius was without a doubt happy to be home after such a lengthy stay in Spain. While the two appeared to be the best of friends and the co-pillars of what remained of the Sullan establishment, they would quickly find themselves at odds. Pompey, who was still very young, wanted to amass more honors and get more commands, and he did that over the course of the 60s. For his part, Metellus Pius dedicated the remaining years of his life to opposing Pompey's irregular career. Pompey was far too popular to attack directly, so Metellus and his allies decided to adopt the strategy that conservative Roman senators had used to try to hamper Scipio Africanus back 100 years before. They went after Pompey's junior supporters in the Senate. The most famous example of how they did this was the trial of Gaius Cornelius, who was accused of maestas, one of the more serious offenses that you could be charged with, and effectively the equivalent of treason. At this trial, for a relatively minor official, Metellus and a few other ex-consuls showed up to testify that this man was definitely guilty. Their concern was not really with justice, with whether Gaius Cornelius was legitimately guilty, but rather with depriving Pompey of a strong enabler in the Senate who could help him pass his legislative agenda and further solidify his standing among the Roman people. During this period from 71 to 63, Metellus Pius was the undisputed leader of the Optimate faction. At this point in time, it is no longer necessary to qualify that term. The term was now in vogue, along with the term boni, the good men, that the Optimates would use to describe themselves. And I think, linguistically speaking, Metellus Pius is probably the first person we could call the leader of that faction in its truly developed and proper sense. So he was in charge of this faction for the 8 years between 71 and 63, and despite the vigorousness of his efforts, he and his allies were ultimately unsuccessful at slowing Pompey down. Most likely part of this is because Metellus Pius was still quite exhausted after his 8-year tour in Spain. Serving in Spain was hard duty for the Romans, and it would appear that it's possible that Metellus' health was compromised by such a lengthy stay. He died early in the year 63 BCE at the age of only 66. Had he lived longer, he would have lived to see the conspiracy of Catiline. However, his early death meant that the conservative position in that debate on what to do about Catiline fell to Cato the Younger, a man so junior that he had served neither as praetor nor as consul at the time of the debate. Although he never achieved the fame of his father, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, in my opinion, was a more important figure to the history of the Republic. He was one of the key players in the final phases of the social war. The Senate selected him to have the honor of instituting the law which gave Italian citizenship, and then entrusted him with the destruction of Silo, the last great leader of the Italians. He was a key player during the Civil War of the 80s and Sulla's right-hand man. He was the pillar of the Sullan order after Sulla's death, and he was the leader of the Optimates, who was ultimately responsible for failing to prevent the rise of Pompey, Crassus, and, yes, Caesar. I didn't mention Caesar earlier because Caesar was very much a member of that Senon-Marian faction. Marius was Caesar's uncle by marriage. Ultimately, after he died, Metellus Pius's position as Pontifex Maximus went not to one of the other senior senators at Rome, but rather to a man who had not quite become praetor yet, or perhaps he was praetor-elect by this point, Gaius Julius Caesar. Now that he had this position, Caesar was able to accomplish great things. As consul, he would have debates with his co-consul Bibulus over what the gods wanted. Bibulus tried to claim that the gods did not approve of the proceedings, but Caesar ultimately had more religious authority because guess what? He's Pontifex Maximus. It's also symbolic that Metellus Pius, the great pillar of the Sullan order, died, and as kind of a rebuke to this fallen political order, voters chose to elect a younger man who was very much the heir apparent to the fallen Senon faction, which was now reviving. Childless, Metellus Pius posthumously adopted Publius Scipio as his son and heir. At this time, Publius Scipio was already the heir of the great family which had produced Scipio Africanus, Scipio Aemilianus, and many other illustrious men. Now he would inherit the name Metellus as well, thus taking on the recent and proud legacy of Metellus Numidicus and Metellus Pius, thus making him at the age of 37 the most pedigreed yet least capable Roman to ever live. Metellus Scipio, the man, the myth, the legend. Metellus Scipio would use his new standing to exercise a great deal of influence for the rest of his life, and I think it's safe to say that no one damaged the Senate's cause more than Metellus Scipio. Let me give you just one example of the genius of Metellus Scipio. At the Battle of Pharsalus, Pompey effectively had Caesar trapped without supplies and outnumbered 2-1. Pompey's victory was assured. All he had to do was literally nothing. However, Metellus Scipio effectively told him that if he declined to fight an open field battle and give Caesar the battlefield defeat he so richly deserved, that he was not a true Roman and that he was a bitch. Pompey was goaded into fighting Caesar in a field battle, lost, and with it lost the civil war. Metellus Scipio then did some other stuff that was equally stupid, and before that he did some other very stupid things. I can't quite count the stupidity of Metellus Scipio against his adopted father, but let's face it, that is an important part of Metellus Pius's legacy. He was the leader of the Optimates, and by adopting Metellus Scipio, he did lend a lot of his prestige to that man. Metellus Scipio then became an important figure within the Optimates, and people took him seriously, even though they really shouldn't have. This played a huge role in the ultimate outcome of the Civil Wars. Ironically enough, Metellus Pius also did a great deal to help Julius Caesar indirectly. Not only did he die at such a time which would allow Caesar to gain a major office, but also his 8-year extended command in Spain was highly irregular, and is one of the more ignored and overlooked precedents which Caesar could draw upon to justify his prolonged command in Gaul. Most people point to either Marius's back-to-back consulships or Pompey's extended command against the pirates and later in the East. However, if I had to bet on what Caesar invoked when he was trying to convince people in the Senate and in the assemblies that he was in the clear when it came to exercising this kind of power for such a long period of time, I'm willing to bet that he invoked the example of Metellus Pius, that arch-conservative who had done the same thing just a generation before. Until next time, I'm Thersites the historian, and I will come back and talk about another great Roman who is underrated and understudied. As George W. Bush would say, the end. Hee hee hee.